My parents thought they pulled off the ultimate heist when they ambushed me at Sunday dinner, loudly announcing they had used a legal loophole to give my older sister access to my investment fund. They demanded I finance her husband's startup. What they did not know was that my fraud alert had tripped 2 days earlier. When I smiled and showed them the remaining account balance of exactly $9.50, my brother-in-law turned completely pale and screamed that he had already written $50,000 in checks against that routing number. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect yourself from entitled relatives. The scent of baked macaroni and cheese and collard greens usually brought me peace, but today the atmosphere in my parents' dining room felt suffocating. I am Kendra, 33 years old, and a corporate forensic accountant working in downtown Atlanta. My days are spent tracing missing funds, exposing corporate embezzlement, and analyzing complex financial structures. I have built a comfortable, successful life entirely on my own. But stepping into my parents' house always felt like stepping onto a battlefield where my achievements were weaponized against me. Sunday dinner was a long-standing tradition in our family. The house was packed with aunts, uncles, and cousins fresh from church service. My father Calvin sat at the head of the long mahogany table carving a roast. My mother Yvonne was directing traffic from the kitchen. Across from me sat my older sister Jada and her white husband Logan. Jada was 35, draped in designer clothes she absolutely could not afford, playing the role of the perfect pampered wife. Logan sat beside her with an unbearable smirk permanently plastered on his face. He had cycled through 4 different career paths since marrying Jada, all of which ended in spectacular failure. But in my family's eyes, he could do no wrong, simply because he had put a ring on the golden child's finger. I was mid-bite of my aunt's famous macaroni and cheese, when the ambient chatter in the room suddenly died down. My mother marched out of the kitchen holding a crisp white banking document. She walked directly to my side of the table and slid the paper across the polished wood until it stopped right next to my plate. I did not immediately reach for it. I looked up at her, noting the triumphant gleam in her eyes. I went to the bank on Friday afternoon. My mother announced, her voice projecting loud enough for every single relative in the dining room to hear. Since I set up your original custodial savings account when you were 16, my name was still technically listed on the master file due to an old administrative oversight. I spoke with the branch manager and authorized a secondary access tier. Jada is now an official joint account holder on your high-yield investment portfolio. The sheer audacity of her words hung in the warm air. I placed my fork down on the porcelain plate with a soft clink. I did not scream. I did not flip the table. My analytical brain immediately went to work processing the legal implications of what she had just confessed to in front of 20 witnesses. Jada leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, looking at me as if she had just won the lottery. Logan chuckled, adjusting the collar of his expensive button-down shirt. "Before you get upset," my mother continued, her tone shifting into a practiced authoritative cadence meant to shame me into submission. "You need to understand that this is for the greater good of our family. Logan has developed a brilliant tech startup that is going to change our family legacy forever. He has the vision, but he needs $150,000 in seed capital to secure his vendors and launch the platform." My father nodded in agreement from the head of the table. "It is a guaranteed return on investment, Kendra. You should be honored to help your brother-in-law get his business off the ground." I looked at Logan. "You want to launch a tech startup? You do not know how to code. You do not have a background in software development. Your last business venture was a failed mobile dog washing service that left Jada begging me to cover her car note." Logan's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his arrogant composure. "I am the visionary Kendra. I hire people to do the coding. Your sister and I are a team and we need capital." My mother slammed her hand on the back of my chair. "You are 33 years old. You have no husband and no children to provide for. You sit in that high-rise office, hoarding your wealth and counting other people's money. It is your duty as a successful Black woman to uplift your own family. You have more than enough sitting in that account doing nothing." We decided it was time to put that money to actual use. Jada has the authorization now, and she will be initiating the transfer tomorrow morning. The absolute silence in the dining room was deafening. My aunts and uncles stared at their plates, too intimidated by my mother's domineering personality to intervene. They fully expected me to lower my head, shed a few tears of frustration, and accept the financial robbery, just to keep the peace. That is what I had always done in the past to survive this family. I picked up my linen napkin, wiped my mouth slowly, and turned my chair to face my mother and sister directly. "Do you remember when I was a 19-year-old college sophomore?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. The room remained dead silent. "I was working 2 part-time jobs just to pay for my textbooks because you refused to help me with tuition. You came to my dorm room and begged me to co-sign a loan for Jada's luxury SUV because her credit was completely trashed from unpaid credit cards. You promised me on everything holy that she would make the payments on time." Jada rolled her eyes. "That was over a decade ago. Let it go." She defaulted 3 months later. I continued ignoring her interruption. "Debt collectors called my dorm room during my final exams. The bank repossessed the car, and my credit score was annihilated. It took me 4 years of grueling, disciplined financial planning to rebuild my credit so I could actually pass the background check to get hired at my accounting firm. I promised myself, sitting in that cramped dorm room, eating cheap noodles, that I would never, ever let you touch my finances again." My mother crossed her arms, her face flushed with anger. "You are being entirely too dramatic and utterly selfish. You are family, and family helps family. Jada already has the legal access. The discussion is over." I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my smartphone. I bypassed the lock screen, opened my primary banking application, and authenticated my identity. I tapped the screen twice to bring up the investment portfolio in question. I placed the phone face up on the polished wood and slid it across the table until it stopped right in front of Logan's plate. "I am a corporate forensic accountant, Mom," I said, leaning back in my chair and matching her authoritative tone. "Did you really think a major commercial bank would not have an automatic fraud alert trigger on a high-yield portfolio? The exact second you tried to bypass the primary authorization protocols on Friday afternoon, my wealth manager flagged the inquiry and called my direct line." I watched as Logan looked down at the bright screen of my phone. His eyes widened in absolute horror. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. "I liquidated the entire portfolio 48 hours ago." I stated clearly, letting the reality of my words sink into their entitled minds. "I moved every single cent into an impenetrable offshore trust that none of you can locate, let alone legally access. The balance you see right there on the screen is all that remains of the account you thought you hijacked. It is exactly $9.50. Jada let out a sharp gasp and snatched the phone from the table, staring at the digital readout as if it were a bomb about to detonate. "No," she whispered, her hands shaking. "No, this cannot be right. Mom said the money was there." Logan suddenly stood up so fast his chair tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. He grabbed his hair, his breathing turning rapid and shallow. His arrogant demeanor shattered, completely replaced by pure, unfiltered panic. "You didn't!" he screamed, his voice cracking in terror as he stared at me across the dining table. "You couldn't have moved it. The account routing number was active on Friday." "It is still active," I replied coldly. "It just does not have any money in it." Logan slammed both of his fists onto the dining table, rattling the fine china and crystal glasses. "I already wrote $50,000 in checks to my vendors against that routing number. They are going to deposit them in the morning." I stood up from the table, picking up my purse. "Then I suggest you call your vendors, Logan, because tomorrow morning you are going to be facing multiple federal charges for check fraud." I did not stay to watch the rest of the meltdown. The sound of Logan hyperventilating and my mother shrieking my name echoed through the hallway as I picked up my designer coat and walked straight out the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, instantly muting the chaos. I stepped into the warm Atlanta evening air, unlocked my car, and drove away. There was no guilt in my chest, only the cold, sharp clarity of a woman who had just dodged a bullet fired by her own blood. By 8 o'clock Monday morning, I was sitting at my desk in my downtown accounting firm, a cup of black coffee in hand, watching the Atlanta skyline wake up. My phone sitting face up on the polished glass desk had been vibrating non-stop since 6 in the morning. I watched the notifications stack up. 14 missed calls from Jada, 9 from my mother, 7 text messages from Logan ranging from begging to outright threatening. I did not answer a single one. Instead, I opened my voicemail app and let the audio play on speaker. Jada was practically hyperventilating through the phone. Her voice was shrill, completely stripped of that fake pampered housewife tone she loved to project. She was screaming that 3 different vendors had already tried to cash Logan's checks first thing in the morning. An event rental company, a commercial leasing agent, and a high-end catering service had all been hit with insufficient funds notices. They were not just angry, they were demanding immediate cash wire transfers by noon, or they were walking straight to the Atlanta Police Department to file felony check fraud charges. Logan had written $50,000 in bad checks, entirely confident that my hard-earned money was sitting there waiting to be plundered. My phone buzzed again, interrupting Jada's hysterical voicemail. It was my father, Calvin. I let it ring 3 times before I finally swiped to answer. I expected a harsh scolding, or maybe a frantic plea for understanding. What I got was a masterclass in manipulation. "Kendra, you need to wire that money right now," Calvin commanded the second the call connected. No greeting, no apology, just an immediate order delivered with the heavy booming voice he used when he wanted to intimidate people at our family church. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. "I need to wire the money. You mean the money your wife and your golden child tried to steal from me yesterday?" "Stop using that word," he snapped. "Nobody stole anything. Your mother made an administrative adjustment to keep this family moving forward. You are destroying your sister's marriage over a technicality. Logan is facing jail time, Kendra. Do you have any idea what this will do to our family's good name? What will the congregation say when they find out my son-in-law was arrested because my own daughter was too stubborn to share her blessings?" I closed my eyes, pressing 2 fingers against my temples. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. For my entire life, my father had prioritized the church's perception over his own children's reality. When Jada failed out of her first semester of college because she was partying too much, he told the congregation she took a medical leave of absence and bought her a new wardrobe to make her feel better. When I graduated with top honors and secured a job at a prestigious firm, he barely clapped, telling people I was just doing what was expected of me. Now he was actually trying to leverage his reputation as a church elder to force me to cover up a felony. "Your good name is not my responsibility, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Logan wrote bad checks. That is a crime. You all thought you could use my life savings to fund his delusional startup and you got caught." Calvin let out a harsh, patronizing sigh. "This is exactly why you are still single, Kendra. You are bitter. You have always been jealous of Jada. She found a good husband, a man with vision and ambition, and you are trying to tear him down because you cannot stand seeing her happy. You are acting like a spiteful, lonely woman. Send the $50,000 today, and we can put all this ugliness behind us. Be the bigger person." The gaslighting was so textbook it almost made me laugh. I realized then that my father did not see me as a daughter. He saw me as an ATM, an asset to be liquidated for the benefit of the child he actually liked. "I will not be sending a single dime," I said firmly. "And if any of you try to contact my financial institutions again, I will be the one calling the police." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto my desk. My heart was pounding, but my professional instincts were fully activated. As a corporate forensic accountant, I tracked digital footprints for a living. I unraveled complex embezzlement schemes and exposed white-collar criminals. My mother had claimed she walked into a bank branch and used a custodial loophole to add Jada to my portfolio. But the more I thought about it, the more that story sounded like complete garbage. Commercial banks did not just add secondary authorized users to high-yield investment accounts, holding 6 figures without the primary account holder present, especially not an account that had been converted from a custodial setup over a decade ago. The compliance protocols were entirely too strict. Something was fundamentally wrong. I turned to my dual monitors and logged into my secure terminal. I bypassed the standard consumer credit bureaus and ran a deep, comprehensive background and asset check on my own social security number using the firm's premium investigative software. I watched the progress bar load, my fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of my desk. When the results populated on the screen, my blood ran absolutely cold. They're filed in the county public records just 5 days ago was a brand new power of attorney. I clicked on the digital PDF and pulled the document up on my right monitor. It granted Jada sweeping, unrestricted financial control over my assets, allowing her to authorize transfers, modify account structures, and act as my legal proxy in all banking matters. I zoomed in on the bottom of the second page. There was my signature perfectly forged, staring back at me. It was a terrifyingly good imitation of my handwriting, the kind of forgery that took practice and deliberate intent. But what caught my eye immediately was the notary stamp sealing the document. I leaned closer to the screen, reading the name on the official seal. The notary was a man I recognized instantly. He was a shady, low-level real estate broker who frequently hung around Logan at family barbecues, always pitching terrible investment ideas and bragging about cutting corners. My mother had not walked into a bank and used a loophole. That was a lie designed to make the theft sound like a harmless administrative adjustment. The reality was a coordinated, premeditated felony. My mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law had conspired with a corrupt notary to forge a legal document, steal my identity, and seize total control of my financial life. They had planned to drain me dry, and they thought I would be too intimidated by family loyalty to fight back. They picked the wrong woman. They picked the wrong career. They picked the wrong target. I grabbed my blazer from the back of my chair and locked my computer terminal. I was not going to wait for their next move. I was going to rip their entire lives apart, and I was going to do it with a paper trail so solid that no church congregation in Atlanta could ever save them. I navigated the midday Atlanta traffic with a singular and chilling focus. My knuckles gripped the leather steering wheel of my car as I drove straight toward Buckhead. I was not going to the police yet. I was going to my attorney, Malik. Malik and I had run in the same circles since our undergraduate days at Howard University. He knew my family. He knew their obsession with appearances. And more importantly, he was a ruthless corporate litigator who thrived on tearing apart fraudulent contracts. I marched into his boutique law firm, bypassed his receptionist with a quick nod, and shut his heavy glass office door behind me. I dropped my laptop bag on his desk and pulled up the digital copy of the power of attorney I had found. Malik took one look at my face, closed his current files, and turned his monitor toward us. Within 20 minutes, Malik had pulled the official county filings and cross-referenced the notary public registration. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. He confirmed my worst suspicions. Yvonne did not just walk into a bank and sweet-talk a teller. She and Jada had actively conspired to forge my signature on a comprehensive financial proxy document. The notary stamp belonged to a man who had his license suspended twice for real estate fraud, the exact kind of bottom feeder Logan would associate with. Malik looked at me, shaking his head in disbelief. Kendra, this is a multi-count felony. They committed identity theft, wire fraud, conspiracy, and forgery. If I submit this to the district attorney, your mother and your sister are looking at real prison time. How could they possibly think they would get away with this? I paced across the thick carpet of his office, the anger settling deep into my bones. Because they do not see it as stealing Malik. They see me as an extension of their own wallet. I stopped pacing and looked at him. You know how Calvin and Yvonne operate. When Jada wrecked her first car because she was driving drunk, my parents did not punish her. They threatened to sue the dealership for selling her defective brakes. When I brought home an A- in advanced calculus, I was grounded for a month because I was not living up to my potential. Jada has spent her entire life failing upward, supported by a safety net made entirely of my parents' delusions. Malik nodded slowly, understanding the toxic dynamic perfectly. He knew that in my family, my success was never celebrated as my own. It was treated as a communal resource. They honestly believed that because I am their daughter, they have a divine right to access my wealth. Wealth, I explained. They justified this forgery by telling themselves they were just redistributing family funds to help Logan step up as the man of the house. They thought that once the money was gone, I would just cry, forgive them, and protect the family name at church. They relied on my silence. Malik began drafting a cease and desist order and a formal fraud declaration for the bank. We were preparing to freeze every single financial avenue tied to my social security number. I felt a momentary wave of relief thinking we had contained the blast radius to the $50,000 in bounced checks. Then my phone chimed. It was not a text message. It was a high-priority email notification. The sender was the commercial lending division of a massive national bank. The subject line read Urgent Notice of Default and Asset Seizure. I opened the email, my blood turning to ice water as I read the legal jargon. I read it twice just to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. I handed the phone to Malik. His jaw tightened as he scanned the screen. Logan did not just write bad checks to his caterers and event planners. He and Jada had walked into that commercial bank 3 days ago with the forged power of attorney. They used my name, my immaculate credit score, and my high-yield investment portfolio to apply for a $200,000 commercial business loan. They pledged my $150,000 account as the primary liquid collateral to secure the cash. The bank approved the loan based on my financial standing. But because I had completely liquidated that portfolio and moved my money to an offshore trust 48 hours ago, the bank went to verify the collateral this morning and found an empty account holding $9. The automated banking system immediately flagged the missing collateral and triggered a hard default on the $200,000 loan. The email was a formal legal notice. Because my name was on the fraudulent loan application, the bank was holding me personally liable for the debt. If the $200,000 was not paid in full immediately, they were initiating proceedings to garnish my wages, place a lien on my luxury condo, and freeze all of my personal checking accounts. Jada and Logan had not just tried to steal my savings. They had weaponized my identity to borrow $250,000, and now the bank was coming to destroy everything I had built. Malik stood up, his professional calm entirely gone. Kendra, we have to call the federal authorities right now. This is a $250,000 bank fraud scheme. They are going to bankrupt you. I stared at the default notice on the screen. The sheer scale of their entitlement was breathtaking. They were willing to sacrifice my home, my career, and my financial future so Logan could play pretend CEO. A normal person would have panicked. A normal person would have broken down in tears at the thought of losing everything to a bank. But I was not a normal person. I was a forensic accountant who knew exactly how to track stolen money, and I knew exactly how to destroy the people who took it. Do not call the police yet, I told Malik, picking up my phone and grabbing my laptop bag. I am going to find out exactly where that $200,000 went. And then I am going to make sure they suffer in ways the legal system could never manage on its own. By 9 o'clock the following morning, my specialized software was already crunching the transaction metadata tied to Logan's fraudulent loan application. I sat in my corner office at Sterling and Hughes Corporate Advisory, the Atlanta skyline, stretching out behind me, completely absorbed in the digital paper trail. I had just initiated a trace on the routing numbers Logan provided to the commercial bank when the sleek multi-line phone on my glass desk lit up. It was the front lobby reception desk. I answered the call, keeping my eyes locked on the scrolling data on my dual monitors. Kendra, the receptionist, whispered, her voice tight with panic. Your mother and sister are down here. I told them you require an appointment for personal visitors, but they are refusing to leave. Your mother is currently threatening to alert the managing partners that you are under criminal investigation. A cold, familiar wave of exhaustion washed over me, immediately followed by a sharp spike of adrenaline. My mother had always weaponized public embarrassment to force my compliance. When I was 17 and declined to give my first summer job paycheck to Jada so she could buy designer prom shoes, my mother stood up in the middle of a crowded Sunday church service and asked the congregation to pray for my selfish, wicked heart. She knew how hard I had worked to build my flawless professional reputation in this high-rise building, and she calculated that the threat of a scene in my corporate lobby would make me fold. Tell building security to stand by, I instructed calmly. I am coming down. I did not rush. I took a moment to smooth the lapels of my tailored navy suit, slipped my phone into my pocket, and walked toward the glass elevators. The descent to the ground floor gave me exactly 30 seconds to compartmentalize my anger and shift into pure, unadulterated corporate hostility. The lobby of Sterling and Hughes was a masterpiece of intimidation, featuring imported Italian marble floors, towering floor-to-ceiling windows, and an atmosphere of hushed, expensive silence. That silence was currently being shattered by my mother's booming voice. "I do not care about your security protocols!" Yvonne was shouting at the terrified receptionist, her heavy gold jewelry clinking as she slammed her hand on the reception desk. "My daughter is a thief. She is holding her own family hostage, and I demand to speak to whoever is in charge of this firm right now." Jada stood right beside her, arms crossed tightly over her chest, wearing oversized sunglasses indoors like some tragic celebrity. She held a thick manila folder in her hands. Several high-profile clients and senior partners were actively pausing their conversations near the elevators, staring at the spectacle. I stepped out of the elevator, the sharp click of my heels echoing across the marble. "Mom, Jada," I said, my voice projecting across the lobby with absolute chilling authority. "You have exactly 10 seconds to lower your voices before I have you arrested for criminal trespass." Yvonne spun around, her eyes flashing with a mix of triumph and absolute fury. "There she is," she announced to the entire lobby, gesturing toward me as if presenting a criminal to a jury. "The woman who wants to send her own brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary over a simple misunderstanding." Jada marched right up to me, shoving the manila folder against my chest. I did not take it. It fell to the marble floor, spilling a stack of commercial banking release forms. "Pick up the pen and sign the waivers!" Kendra Jada demanded, her voice shaking with rage. "The bank locked Logan out of his business accounts this morning. You need to sign the release acknowledging that the $200,000 loan was authorized by you as a family investment. If you do not sign it right now, the bank is going to default the loan and press charges." I looked down at the scattered papers, then back up at my sister's frantic, entitled face. "You committed identity theft, Jada. You and your husband forged a power of attorney to collateralize a commercial loan against my assets. And now you expect me to perjure myself and assume $250,000 of your fraudulent debt just to save your husband from prison." Yvonne stepped into my personal space, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous hiss, meant only for me. "You will sign those papers, Kendra. You have a duty to this family. Logan is a husband and a father. You have nothing but a fancy job and an empty apartment. You can absorb the credit hit. We will pay you back eventually. But if you let him go to jail, you will destroy your sister's life, and I will make sure every single person in Atlanta knows exactly what a ruthless, cold-hearted snake you really are. I will march up to your managing partner's office right now and tell them you are under federal investigation for embezzling family funds." The sheer delusion was staggering. She actually believed her authority as my mother superseded federal banking regulations. She thought she could bully a licensed corporate forensic accountant into absorbing a felony. I did not shrink. I did not cry. I signaled the chief of security, a towering former military police officer who had been waiting quietly near the security turnstiles. He immediately stepped forward, flanked by two other uniformed guards. "Mom," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the pristine lobby, ensuring every partner and client present heard exactly what was happening. "You are standing in a federally regulated financial institution. You just publicly threatened to sabotage my professional licensing through defamation unless I sign a fraudulent bank release to cover up a felony forgery. That is not a family disagreement. That is criminal extortion." Yvonne's mouth fell open. Her eyes darted to the security officers closing in around them. "You would not dare," she whispered, her confidence finally cracking. "I am a licensed fiduciary," I continued, stepping closer to her, radiating absolute ice. "Attempting to extort me in my place of business carries a mandatory minimum sentence. I highly suggest you pick up your fraudulent paperwork and exit this building before I instruct these officers to detain you for the Atlanta Police Department." Jada panicked, dropping to her knees to scramble for the scattered release forms. She shoved them back into her designer purse, her hands shaking violently. "You are sick, Kendra." Jada cried out, tears of humiliation welling in her eyes as the chief of security firmly grasped her arm. "We are your blood. We are supposed to be a team. Logan is trying to build a future for us, and you are destroying it out of spite." The security officers began physically escorting them toward the heavy glass revolving doors. My mother was shouting obscenities, completely abandoning her respectable church lady facade, cursing my name and swearing I would burn in hell for turning my back on my own blood. I walked alongside them as they were marched toward the exit, keeping pace with Jada. She was sobbing now, playing the victim perfectly, mourning the collapse of her husband's brilliant business venture. As the security chief pushed the revolving door to force them out onto the busy downtown sidewalk, I leaned in closely right next to Jada's ear so only she could hear my final words. "By the way, Jada," I whispered, my tone devoid of any sympathy, "I spent the entire morning looking into the routing numbers for Logan's so-called vendors. You might want to ask your brilliant husband where that $200,000 really went, because I can assure you it certainly was not spent on a tech startup." I stepped back into the glass elevator and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. My reflection in the mirrored walls stared back at me, sharp and composed. My heart beat with a steady rhythmic thud. I had just humiliated my mother and sister in the middle of a corporate lobby, but there was zero guilt in my chest. They had walked into my professional sanctuary, intending to destroy my career over a forged bank document. They expected me to fold. Instead, I handed them a terrifying reality check. But kicking them out was only the defensive play. Now it was time to go on the offensive. I walked back into my corner office, locked the heavy wooden door, and sat down at my dual-monitor workstation. I cracked my knuckles and opened my firm's premium investigative software. As a corporate forensic accountant, tracking hidden assets and exposing financial fraud is not just my job, it is my absolute specialty. Logan thought he was a mastermind because he managed to convince my gullible mother to stamp a fraudulent power of attorney. He assumed that commercial banking was just like asking his father-in-law for a handout. He had no idea the kind of digital footprint he had left behind, and he certainly had no idea how quickly I could unravel his entire pathetic life. I started by running a deep search on his so-called tech startup. According to the loan application data I had legally subpoenaed through my attorney earlier that morning, the company was registered under the name Apex Innovations. It took me exactly 4 minutes to pull the incorporation documents from the state registry. Logan had registered the limited liability company online for $99 just 3 weeks ago. There was no board of directors. There was no registered commercial address, only the residential address of the suburban house he shared with Jada. I dug deeper into the commercial bank application. To secure a $200,000 business loan, you have to submit a business plan, projected revenue, and vendor invoices. I pulled the routing data from the $50,000 in bad checks Logan had frantically written against my empty account over the weekend. My mother had proudly declared at Sunday dinner that Logan needed my capital to pay his software developers and secure server space. I cross-referenced the vendor banking details. The accounts did not belong to tech companies or software engineers. One routing number belonged to an exotic car rental agency in Buckhead. Another trace led straight to a high-end jewelry broker known for importing custom diamond watches. A third check for $15,000 was made out to a boutique travel agency specializing in private island charters in the Caribbean. There was no tech company, there was no software, there were no developers. Apex Innovations was a phantom corporation, a hollow shell created solely to pass the initial underwriting filters of a commercial bank. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and took a sip of my cold coffee. The absolute foolishness of it all was staggering. My parents had spent the last 5 years parading Logan around our church as a visionary entrepreneur. My father, Calvin, loved having a white son-in-law. He could show off to the congregation, treating him like a trophy of upward mobility. Calvin and Yvonne completely ignored the fact that Jada worked 60 hours a week selling real estate just to pay the minimum balances on Logan's maxed-out credit cards. They wanted the aesthetic of generational wealth without the actual labor required to build it. They were so desperate to believe in Logan's genius that they actively committed federal identity theft against their own hardworking daughter to fund his delusions. But luxury car rentals and jewelry did not explain the sheer panic I had seen in Logan's eyes when he realized my account was empty. A man does not risk federal prison just to rent a sports car. There was a massive black hole in his finances, and I was going to find it. I accessed the historical bank statements Logan had been forced to submit during the loan underwriting process. I followed the cash flow from his primary checking account over the last 8 months. The pattern was erratic, chaotic, and screamed of desperation. He had been slowly draining the joint savings account he shared with Jada. $10,000 here, $20,000 there. The money was being funneled into a decentralized cryptocurrency exchange based in the Bahamas. I ran a blockchain trace using my firm's proprietary software. Logan was not just buying cryptocurrency. He was trading on high-risk margin accounts. He had bought into a heavily hyped alternative coin at the absolute peak of the market, leveraging borrowed money at a terrifying 10-to-1 ratio. When the crypto market inevitably crashed 2 months ago, his positions were completely wiped out. He was liquidated. Over $120,000 of Jada's savings vanished into the digital ether in a matter of seconds. That was why he was desperate. That was why he pushed my mother to forge the power of attorney. He needed that $200,000 commercial loan to cover his catastrophic gambling losses before Jada realized her entire life savings was gone. He thought he could steal my investment portfolio, use it as collateral to get the cash pay back the missing funds, and no one would ever be the wiser. I shook my head, feeling a mixture of disgust and dark satisfaction. Jada had spent her entire morning screaming at me in my corporate lobby, defending a husband who had already bankrupted her behind her back. But the money trail did not stop at the crypto exchange. As I scrolled through the remaining outgoing wire transfers, a specific repeating transaction caught my eye. It was a scheduled automated clearinghouse transfer. Exactly $4,000 withdrawn on the first of every single month for the past year. The recipient was listed as a Premier Property Management Corporation. I highlighted the routing number and ran a cross-match against the Atlanta Commercial Real Estate Registry. The property management company owned and operated a highly exclusive luxury high-rise apartment building in the heart of Midtown Atlanta. The building featured rooftop infinity pools, private elevators, and a 24-hour concierge service. It was definitely not the suburban house where Logan lived with my sister. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I bypassed the public records and accessed a specialized tenant screening database used by corporate auditors. I punched in the address of the Midtown high-rise and cross-referenced it with the unit numbers managed by that specific holding company. I found the unit tied to the exact $4,000 monthly payment. I pulled the active lease agreement. The tenant's name was not Jada. The tenant was not Logan. The name on the lease was Chloe Davis. I ran a quick social media query. Chloe Davis was 23 years old. Her occupation was listed online as a digital influencer and lifestyle model. Her profile was filled with photos of her posing on luxury balconies, carrying designer bags, and dining at exclusive Atlanta restaurants. She was living a remarkably lavish lifestyle for someone fresh out of college, entirely subsidized by the $4,000 a month being quietly wired from Logan's account. I sat in the quiet of my office, the glowing screens illuminating my face. The puzzle was completely solved. Logan was not just a terrible businessman trying to cover up his incompetence. He was stealing my money, putting my parents standing in the community on the line, and pushing them to commit federal forgery, all to fund a double life. My mother had looked me dead in the eye at Sunday dinner and demanded I sacrifice my hard-earned wealth to support a man trying to build a family legacy. Meanwhile, her beloved son-in-law was paying $4,000 a month to play sugar daddy to a 23-year-old girl across town. I picked up my smartphone and looked at the blocked call notifications from my sister. Jada was likely sitting at home right now, weeping over her husband's failed business dreams, furious at me for refusing to save him. She had no idea her marriage was a financial crater and an emotional sham. I smiled, a cold, calculated expression. I had all the ammunition I needed. I was not just going to destroy Logan's fraudulent loan. I was going to burn his entire existence to the ground, and I was going to make sure my parents had front-row seats to the inferno they helped create. I sat in my office staring at the digital footprint of Logan's double life. I had the crypto exchange losses. I had the luxury lease agreement for his 23-year-old mistress. I had the exact weapon required to detonate his fake marriage and humiliate my family. But I did not pull the trigger right then. In my line of work, you never interrupt an adversary while they are in the middle of making a fatal mistake. I locked my computer terminal, packed my briefcase, and went home to wait for their next move. I did not have to wait long. The following afternoon, I was wrapping up a forensic audit for a corporate client when my receptionist paged me. A courier was waiting in the lobby and insisted on handing a package directly to me. I walked out to find a man in a rumpled gray suit, holding a thick manila envelope. He asked if I was Kendra. When I confirmed my identity, he shoved the envelope against my chest, stated that I was officially served, and walked out of the building. I took the envelope back to my desk and tore open the seal. I expected a desperate plea or maybe a cease and desist letter from whatever cheap legal counsel Logan could afford. What I found was a formal civil lawsuit filed against me in county court. The plaintiffs listed at the top of the page were my own parents, Calvin and Yvonne, along with Jada. I read the charges and actually laughed out loud in my empty office. They were suing me for breach of verbal family contract and fiduciary negligence. The lawsuit outlined a complete work of fiction. My parents claimed under penalty of perjury that the $150,000 in my investment portfolio was not my money at all. They stated it was generational family wealth. The document alleged they had temporarily parked the funds in my account years ago for tax purposes, with a verbal agreement that the money would be released back to the family trust whenever my father requested it. They claimed I was legally obligated to fund Logan's tech startup because it was an approved family investment. They were demanding a judge order me to repatriate the offshore funds immediately and pay punitive damages for their emotional distress. Generational family wealth. The phrase made my blood boil as I read it over and over. When I was 20 years old, I begged my father for $500 to cover my remaining tuition balance so I would not get dropped from my accounting classes. He looked me right in the eye and said he did not have it. 2 weeks later, he threw a lavish birthday party for Jada at a country club, complete with a catered ice sculpture and a hired live band. I paid my tuition by working double shifts at a local diner, coming home smelling like grease while my family drank champagne on my father's dime. They did not have generational wealth. They had massive credit card debt and an obsession with looking rich. I left my office and drove straight to my attorney. Malik took the manila envelope from my hands the second I walked into his boutique law firm. He sat behind his heavy oak desk, his eyes scanning the pages rapidly. Within 3 minutes, his professional composure shattered entirely. He tossed the legal packet across his desk and let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Kendra, this is absolute garbage," Malik said, pointing at the signature on the last page. "They hired a bottom-feeding billboard lawyer who probably took this case on contingency because your parents convinced him you are sitting on millions. The legal arguments do not even make sense. A verbal family contract is not a recognized legal standing for seizing a liquidated financial asset that has been in your name for over a decade. I am filing an immediate motion to dismiss with prejudice. I will have this thrown out by Friday morning, and I am going to petition the judge to sanction this hack of an attorney for filing a frivolous lawsuit." Malik turned to his computer and started typing rapidly on his keyboard, ready to draft the dismissal notice, right then and there. I walked over to his desk and placed my hand flat on his keyboard, stopping his fingers. He looked up at me completely confused. "Do not dismiss it," I told him calmly. Malik stared at me like I had lost my mind. He told me that letting this move forward was a massive waste of my time and money. He explained that my parents were just trying to bully me into signing the commercial bank release forms by tying me up in civil court. The bank was currently holding me liable for the $200,000 loan Logan and Jada took out using the forged power of attorney. If the bank defaulted on that loan, the financial ruin would eventually hit my parents too, since they were clearly trying to cover for Logan's crimes. Malik insisted they were using the legal system to terrorize me into saving them, and shutting it down immediately was the only logical move. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window in his office, looking down at the heavy Atlanta traffic. I knew exactly what my family was doing, but dismissing the case would just send them scurrying back into the shadows to plan their next attack. If we shut this lawsuit down today, my mother would run straight to our church congregation and play the ultimate victim. She would stand at the pulpit and cry, telling everyone that her evil, greedy daughter used high-priced lawyers to silence her and steal the family's money. I refused to give her that narrative. I refused to let them control the story anymore. I turned back to Malik and told him to formally accept the lawsuit. I told him to contact their cheap lawyer today and request an immediate recorded deposition for all parties involved. Malik stood up and crossed his arms, warning me that a deposition meant sitting in a small room with my mother and sister, answering their lawyer's questions on the official legal record. He reminded me that Jada and Yvonne would use the opportunity to insult me, gaslight me, and try to break me down emotionally, just like they had done my entire life. I walked back to his desk, placed my hands on the polished wood, and smiled. That is exactly what I want them to do, Malik. You know my family. You know how they operate. Their arrogance is their biggest weakness. They genuinely believe they are smarter than everyone else in the room because they have never faced actual consequences. They think because I have always been the scapegoat, I will eventually cower and surrender when they raise their voices and demand respect. If we put Jada and my mother in a sterile conference room with a video camera rolling and a court stenographer typing every single word, they will not be able to help themselves. If I play the intimidated, heartbroken, exhausted daughter, they will gloat. They will brag about outsmarting me. And while they are busy stroking their own massive egos and trying to put me in my place, they are going to talk themselves right into a federal prison sentence. We are not just fighting a frivolous civil lawsuit. We are setting a perjury trap, and I am going to let them walk right into it. The conference room in Malik's downtown office was practically freezing, but the chill in the air had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the absolute sterile environment of a legal battleground. The long glass table reflected the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. At the far end of the table sat the court reporter, her fingers resting lightly on her stenotype machine, waiting for the circus to begin. The small red light on the digital audio recorder glowed like a warning beacon. I sat next to Malik, keeping my hands folded neatly in my lap. For this particular performance, I had carefully curated my appearance. I wore a plain beige cardigan over a simple blouse, and I had intentionally skipped my usual immaculate makeup routine. I let the natural exhaustion of the past week show on my face. My shoulders were slightly slumped. I kept my gaze fixed downward, occasionally letting a heavy, defeated sigh escape my lips. I looked exactly like a woman who had been completely broken by the relentless weight of her family's demands. Across the table sat my mother Yvonne and my sister Jada. They looked like they were attending a victory parade. Yvonne wore a tailored church suit, her posture rigid with maternal authority, her face radiating the smug satisfaction of a parent who believed she had finally brought her rebellious child to heel. Jada sat beside her, draped in a designer silk blouse she had undoubtedly purchased on a maxed-out credit card. She was filing her nails, looking bored and utterly untouchable. Flanking them was their legal representation, a man named Desmond. Malik had correctly identified him as a bottom-feeding billboard lawyer the moment he walked into the room. Desmond wore a suit that was one size too large and completely drenched in cheap cologne. He was the kind of lawyer who thrived on bullying intimidated people into quick settlements, and looking at my slumped posture, he clearly thought I was going to be an easy target. The deposition began with the standard legal formalities. Desmond puffed out his chest, leaned over the glass table, and started firing questions at me with an aggressive, theatrical cadence. He wanted to establish the narrative that my investment portfolio was actually a communal family fund. Now Kendra, Desmond began pointing a cheap plastic pen at me. Is it not true that your mother Yvonne was the original custodian of the banking profile in question when you were a teenager? Yes, I answered softly, making my voice sound small and fragile. And is it not true? Desmond pressed a triumphant smirk, spreading across his face, that in African American households, it is a common cultural expectation that financial blessings are shared to uplift the family unit, especially when directed by the matriarch. Malik immediately sat forward. Objection. Opposing counsel is asking my client to testify on broad sociological generalizations rather than established financial facts. Desmond waved his hand dismissively. I am simply establishing the verbal family contract, counselor. He turned back to me. Kendra, your parents entrusted you with maintaining this generational wealth. When your mother adjusted the account access to include your sister, she was simply exercising her managerial rights over family assets, correct? I looked up at my mother. Yvonne was staring at me with a hard, unyielding expression, silently daring me to contradict her in front of these men. I let my eyes drop back to the table. I swallowed hard, acting as though the emotional toll of fighting them was simply too much to bear. I worked 80-hour weeks to build that portfolio, I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly on the last word. Every dollar in that account came from my corporate bonuses and my personal investments. It was my safety net. Desmond chuckled, a patronizing sound that echoed in the quiet room. A safety net that your mother graciously helped you establish. Let the record show, the plaintiff acknowledges her mother's foundational role in her financial life. I felt Malik shift slightly beside me. He knew exactly what I was doing. We had rehearsed this entire routine. I was giving Desmond just enough vague, submissive answers to make him feel like he was dominating the room. I was feeding their collective ego, letting them build a massive pedestal of arrogance. Because the higher they climbed, the harder the fall was going to be. I shifted my focus away from the cheap lawyer and looked directly at Jada. My older sister had stopped filing her nails. She was watching me with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. She hated seeing me play the victim because she firmly believed that role belonged exclusively to her. In Jada's mind, I was the villain who refused to blindly finance her white husband's delusional lifestyle. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the glass table. I looked at Jada with an expression of profound, heartbroken confusion. "I just do not understand, Jada," I said, keeping my tone incredibly soft and pleading. "We grew up together. You know how hard I worked to get my accounting degree after they ruined my credit. You know how many nights I stayed up studying while you were out living your life." Jada rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, dramatic scoff. "Oh, here we go. The martyr speech." Desmond tried to intervene. "I will handle the questioning, Kendra." But I ignored him, keeping my teary eyes locked entirely on my sister. "Why did you feel entitled to it, Jada?" I asked, my voice trembling with manufactured pain. "If Logan needed money for his business, why didn't you just come to me and ask for a loan? Why did you feel the need to go behind my back and bypass my security?" Jada's face flushed with immediate hot anger. She hated being questioned. She had spent her entire life being shielded from accountability by my parents, completely insulated from the consequences of her own actions. Being gently interrogated by the younger sister she viewed as inferior was an insult her fragile golden child ego simply could not tolerate. "Because you are impossible to deal with?" Jada snapped, slamming her hands down on the table. The sharp sound made the court reporter flinch, but her fingers kept flying across the stenotype machine, capturing every single word. "Jada," Desmond cautioned, holding up a hand. "Let me handle this." But Jada was already triggered. She leaned aggressively over the glass table, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "You sit in your fancy high-rise office and you judge us. You judge Logan because he actually has dreams instead of just being a corporate drone like you. You do not have a husband. You do not have children. You have absolutely no responsibilities other than yourself." I shrank back in my chair, projecting sheer intimidation. I let a single tear slip down my cheek. "But it was my money," I whispered weakly. "I earned it." "You hoard it!" Jada screamed, her voice echoing off the conference room walls, completely losing whatever shred of composure she had left. "You are a selfish, miserable workaholic who cares more about a bank balance than her own blood. Logan needed that capital to secure our future, and you were perfectly fine watching him fail just so you could feel superior." Yvonne reached out and grabbed Jada's arm, her maternal instincts finally sensing that the conversation was shifting into dangerous territory. "Jada, calm down. The lawyer is handling the questions." But the bait was set, and Jada had swallowed the hook completely. She yanked her arm away from my mother, her eyes wide with frantic, entitled rage. She wanted to hurt me. She wanted to prove on the legal record that she was entirely justified in taking what belonged to me. "We asked you for help for years, and you always said no." Jada yelled, completely ignoring her lawyer's frantic hand gestures to be quiet. "You forced our hand. Kendra, Mom, and I had to sign your name on that power of attorney because you were too cheap and too bitter to help your own family." The echo of Jada screaming those words bounced off the sterile walls of the conference room and hung in the freezing air. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of the court reporter typing every single syllable into the official transcript. I did not move a muscle for 3 full seconds. I let the weight of her admission settle over the glass table. Then the transformation happened. It was instantaneous. The trembling in my shoulders ceased. My slumped posture straightened with the sharp precision of a steel trap snapping shut. The manufactured tears pooled in my eyes, dried up instantly, replaced by a gaze so cold and calculating it made the air in the room drop another 10 degrees. The fragile, heartbroken daughter vanished. The corporate forensic accountant took her seat. I turned my head slowly, looking past my mother and my sister, and locked eyes with the court reporter sitting at the end of the table. "Did you get that?" I asked, my voice completely stripped of any emotion, projecting the crisp, authoritative tone I used when dismantling hostile corporate executives. "Please confirm for the record that you captured the plaintiff explicitly stating she and her mother forged my signature on the power of attorney document." The court reporter, a seasoned professional who had likely witnessed hundreds of depositions, did not even look up from her machine. "Yes, ma'am," she replied in a flat, even voice. "The statement is on the record." Across the table, Desmond finally processed the catastrophic magnitude of what had just occurred. The bottom-feeding lawyer realized his own client had just handed the opposing counsel a verified sworn confession to a federal crime. Desmond gasped, choking violently on the sip of lukewarm coffee he had just taken. He slammed his ceramic mug down on the glass table so hard the brown liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the sleeves of his cheap, oversized suit. "Strike that!" Desmond shouted, his face turning an alarming shade of blotchy purple. He waved his hands frantically in the air, leaning across the table as if he could physically grab the words back from the stenotype machine. "Strike that entire outburst from the record." My client was provoked into a state of emotional distress. She misspoke under duress. "Jada, shut your mouth. Do not say another word." Malik let out a low, dark chuckle from the seat beside me. He smoothly adjusted his expensive silk tie and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "You know as well as I do that you cannot strike a voluntary statement from a sworn deposition counselor." Malik said, his voice dripping with professional condescension. "Your client was not under duress. She was answering a direct question regarding her financial motivations. She spoke freely without coercion and confessed to felony identity theft, wire fraud, conspiracy, and forgery. The record stands exactly as typed." Jada looked rapidly between her lawyer and my attorney, the arrogant fire in her eyes suddenly flickering out, replaced by a dawn of genuine terror. The golden child was not used to spaces where her actions had actual permanent consequences. She looked at our mother, expecting Yvonne to perform her usual magic trick of making Jada's mistakes disappear. Yvonne grabbed the edge of the glass table, her knuckles turning white. Her pristine church lady facade was fracturing in real time. She tried to deploy her usual weapon, the booming voice of maternal authority that commanded respect in our family home and the church pews. "This is a complete misunderstanding," Yvonne declared, puffing out her chest, trying to project dominance over the legal professionals in the room. "I am her mother. I birthed her. I managed her accounts for years before she even knew what a stock portfolio was. We have implied administrative rights to secure the family legacy. No judge in Atlanta is going to penalize a mother and a sister for moving family funds to support a struggling son-in-law. We were protecting Logan, and we were protecting the family name." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life prioritizing my sister's comfort over my basic survival. I remembered being a 16-year-old girl, watching Yvonne march into a high-end boutique in Buckhead after Jada had been caught shoplifting a designer handbag. My mother had charmed the store manager, paid triple the cost of the bag in cash, and promised the church would pray for the store's prosperity, all to keep the police from filing charges against her precious eldest daughter. Yvonne firmly believed that the rules of the world were merely suggestions that did not apply to her favored child. "This is not a department store, Mom," I said, my voice slicing through her delusions with surgical precision. "This is a sworn legal proceeding. You cannot sweet-talk a federal magistrate. You cannot buy off a commercial bank that is currently holding $200,000 of fraudulent debt. You just admitted on the record that you bypassed banking security protocols by forging my signature. That is not an administrative adjustment. That is a minimum of 5 years in a federal penitentiary." Jada let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. She pushed her chair back, her hands flying to her face. Mom, what is she talking about prison? We just signed a piece of paper so Logan could get the business loan. You told me it was a loophole. You said Kendra would just get mad, but she could not do anything about it. I did not even give Yvonne a chance to respond. I kept my eyes locked on Jada, watching the golden pedestal she had stood on for 35 years crumble into dust. You should have asked your brilliant white husband how commercial lending actually works before you helped him commit bank fraud, I told my sister coldly. Logan needed cash because he is a failure. You needed cash because you refused to live within your means. And both of you were arrogant enough to believe I would just absorb $250,000 in debt to save your fragile marriage. You walked into this deposition thinking you were going to bully me into a settlement. Instead, you just handed me the exact weapon I need to destroy his life and yours. Desmond was sweating profusely now. The cheap cologne radiating off his body smelled sharp and sour with panic. He began furiously packing his legal pads and scattered documents back into his scuffed leather briefcase. He realized he was no longer sitting in a frivolous civil lawsuit regarding a verbal family contract. He was sitting in the middle of a massive criminal conspiracy, and remaining attached to this case would likely cost him his license to practice law. This deposition is suspended, Desmond stammered, avoiding eye contact with Malik and me. I need to confer with my clients in private. We are leaving. You are not conferring with anyone, Desmond Malik stated smoothly, leaning back in his chair with a look of absolute satisfaction. Because if you continue to represent clients you now know have committed active ongoing bank fraud, I will personally file a grievance with the State Bar Association by 3 o'clock this afternoon. Desmond froze, his hand hovering over the clasp of his briefcase. He looked at Yvonne, who was glaring at him, expecting him to fight for her. Then he looked at Jada, who was practically hyperventilating in her expensive silk blouse. He made the only self-preserving choice available to a bottom-feeding lawyer. As of this moment, I am officially withdrawing as counsel for the plaintiffs, Desmond announced loudly, ensuring the court reporter captured his resignation. I can no longer represent these individuals in this civil matter. You cannot leave us, Yvonne shouted, standing up and pointing a trembling finger at the retreating lawyer. We paid you a retainer. We are upstanding members of the community. Desmond did not even look back. He shoved his way out of the heavy glass doors and sprinted down the hallway toward the elevators, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and my toxic family. Yvonne turned her fury back to me, her chest heaving, the vein in her neck pulsing with unrestrained rage. You planned this, she hissed, her church lady persona entirely gone, leaving behind only the vicious, controlling woman I had known my whole life. You dragged us down here just to trap your own sister. You are a wicked, vindictive girl, Kendra. You think you are so smart with your degrees and your corporate job, but you are nothing but a traitor to your own blood. We will hire a real lawyer. We will fight you in court until you do not have a dime left to your name. I stood up slowly, taking my time. I buttoned the single button of my tailored navy blazer, smoothing the fabric with absolute calm. I looked down at my mother and sister, feeling a profound, beautiful sense of liberation. For 33 years, they had wielded family loyalty like a weapon to keep me in my place. Today, I was stripping them of their ammunition permanently. The civil lawsuit is over. Mom, I said, picking up my designer handbag and sliding the strap over my shoulder. There is no court battle for you to fight. You just proved my entire defense on the official record. But you have much bigger problems to worry about now than a frivolous lawsuit against me. Jada looked up, her mascara running down her cheeks, her face a mask of pure terror. What do you mean, bigger problems? I smiled, a chilling corporate smile that did not reach my eyes. I looked directly at the deposition, then back to the two women who had tried to ruin my life. Did you really think my attorney and I were just sitting here asking questions for our own amusement? I asked softly. This entire deposition was being live-streamed through a secure encrypted audio link. Malik's paralegal has been sitting in the office next door recording every single word. Yvonne stepped back, stumbling slightly against her chair. We did not just want your confession for this civil case, I explained, walking toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room. We needed the audio file. And while your cheap lawyer was busy packing his briefcase and running for the hills, Malik's paralegal already forwarded the raw, unedited audio recording of your felony confession directly to the district attorney's white-collar fraud division. Jada let out a raw, guttural scream, burying her face in her hands as the reality of her impending arrest finally crashed down on her. Yvonne stood completely frozen, staring at me, as if she were looking at a ghost, finally realizing that the daughter she had always treated like a disposable asset was the one holding the match to her entire world. I did not stay to watch them break down. I turned my back on them and walked out of the conference room, the sharp click of my heels echoing down the hallway, leaving them trapped in the sterile room with the court reporter and the consequences of their own unbelievable arrogance. The click of my heels against the marble floor felt like a victory march as Malik and I walked out of the deposition center. We stepped out of the high-rise building, and the humid Atlanta air hit my face. I breathed it in deeply. It was the scent of absolute vindication. My mother and sister were still trapped in that freezing conference room upstairs, entirely paralyzed by the reality of what they had just done. But my job was not finished yet. The criminal element was secured the moment my sister bragged into a live microphone. The district attorney had the audio file in their possession. Now I needed to sever the final financial chain tying me to their disaster before the commercial bank tore my life apart. I left Malik to file the formal legal complaints and drove my car straight to the commercial bank branch that had issued the fraudulent business loan. I did not bother making an appointment. As a licensed corporate fiduciary, I knew exactly how to bypass the front desk tellers and demand an immediate audience with the vice president of commercial lending. I was directed to a sprawling glass-enclosed office at the back of the building. The bank executive sat behind his heavy oak desk, looking thoroughly annoyed by my sudden intrusion. His annoyance vanished the second I dropped the certified deposition transcript right on top of his keyboard. I did not raise my voice. I simply pointed to the highlighted section where Jada explicitly admitted to forging my signature on the power of attorney. I informed him with razor-sharp precision that his underwriting department had approved a massive commercial loan based on a fraudulent document and a compromised investment portfolio. The executive scrambled. He frantically pulled up the loan file on his monitor, his fingers trembling as he typed my social security number into the database. He knew that if I filed a formal complaint with the federal banking regulators, his entire branch would be subjected to a catastrophic audit for failing to verify a forged signature on a $250,000 disbursement. He wanted this problem to disappear immediately. Within 10 minutes, he was printing out a formal liability release on official bank letterhead. My name, my personal assets, and my previously targeted investment portfolio were officially scrubbed from the defaulted debt. I was legally cleared. My financial future was safe from their incompetence. But commercial banks do not just write off $200,000 in losses without a fight. The executive wiped sweat from his forehead and let out a heavy sigh. He muttered under his breath that the compliance team would immediately begin the asset seizure process on the secondary collateral to recoup the stolen cash. I stopped halfway to the door. My forensic accounting instincts flared to life, burning through my chest. I turned around and looked at him. I asked him exactly what secondary collateral he was talking about. My mind raced through the financial profiles of my family members. Logan did not own a single tangible asset. He drove a leased luxury vehicle and rented his lifestyle on credit. Jada was drowning in retail debt. Neither of them could even qualify for a premium credit card, let alone pledge a hard asset worth $200,000 to secure a massive commercial business loan. The bank executive hesitated, stammering something about client confidentiality and privacy protocols. I leaned over his desk, planting both hands flat on the polished wood, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. I reminded him that my identity was stolen to originate this specific loan profile. That made me a primary victim of financial fraud perpetrated by his clients within his very branch. I demanded to see the entire loan origination file right then and there, or I would have my attorney file an emergency injunction and have the police serve a warrant for the documents before lunchtime. He swallowed hard, terrified of the legal exposure. He turned his monitor toward me. I stared at the glowing screen, scanning the digitized pages of the loan agreement with trained analytical speed. My eyes locked onto the secondary asset schedule listed on page 4. My breath caught in my throat. There was a property deed attached to the file. It was a four-bedroom brick-front pristine suburban house located in one of the most affluent neighborhoods in Atlanta. It was my parents' house. My mind instantly flashed back to a Sunday morning at our church just 3 months ago. It was Men's Day. My father Calvin had practically sprinted to the pulpit to give his testimony. He stood up there in a custom-tailored suit, gripping the microphone, and bragged to a congregation of 500 people that he and Yvonne had officially paid off their mortgage. He puffed out his chest and declared their fully owned home a shining beacon of Black excellence and generational wealth. I used that moment to preach down to the younger couples in the pews, lecturing them about financial discipline and Christian responsibility. My mother sat in the front row wearing an oversized designer hat, nodding proudly and soaking up the admiration of the church elders while looking like the ultimate untouchable matriarch. It was all a spectacular, sickening lie. I looked closer at the digital signatures on the bank file. Calvin and Yvonne had secretly pledged the deed to their fully paid house as the ultimate backup collateral to secure Logan's fake tech startup loan. They knew Jada's husband had no money and no credit, so they bet the roof over their own heads on a white son-in-law who was actively funneling their money to an offshore crypto scam and paying a luxury lease for a 23-year-old mistress. They did not just try to sacrifice my life savings. They had willingly sacrificed their own home to protect their golden child's fragile marriage. The level of delusion was absolutely staggering. They were so desperate to maintain the illusion of a wealthy, successful family that they literally signed away their actual wealth to keep up the facade. They believed my investment account would cover the primary loan, keeping their house safe. But because I emptied my account and triggered the default, their house was now the only asset left on the chopping block. I asked the bank executive what the current status of the loan was. He did not look me in the eye. He pulled up the collection dashboard and pointed to a glaring red status bar flashing on the screen. Because the loan was in hard default and the primary collateral had completely failed, the bank's automated collection system had already triggered the secondary asset protocol. The executive clicked a button on his keyboard. A heavy commercial printer in the corner of the office hummed to life. He pulled the fresh sheet of paper from the tray and placed it carefully on the desk. It was a formal notice of foreclosure. The bank was legally initiating the process to seize my parents' home. They had exactly 30 days before the property would be auctioned off on the courthouse steps to the highest bidder to recoup the stolen $200,000. My parents had just humiliated themselves in a recorded deposition, confessing to a federal felony to save a man who was simultaneously bankrupting them. And now they were about to lose the very foundation of their high society church persona. The irony was so perfect, so incredibly poetic, that it felt like pure oxygen filling my lungs. I reached out and took a copy of that foreclosure notice, folding it neatly and slipping it into my designer bag. I walked out of the bank with a brand new strategy forming in my mind, realizing that true justice was not just about watching them lose everything, but owning the very ground they stood on. I walked out of the commercial bank branch and stepped into the blistering heat of the Atlanta afternoon, sliding my sunglasses over my face. My designer heels clicked against the pavement in a steady, unyielding rhythm. The foreclosure notice I had just pulled from the bank executive was safely tucked inside my leather bag. It burned against my side like a loaded weapon. My parents had exactly 30 days before the bank auctioned off their pristine suburban mansion to recoup the $250,000 Logan had stolen. A normal daughter might have felt a shred of pity. A normal daughter might have called them, warned them, or offered to help them negotiate a payment plan. But my parents had permanently destroyed my capacity for grace the moment they decided my financial ruin was an acceptable price to pay for their golden child's happiness. I got into my car and immediately dialed Malik. He answered on the second ring, expecting me to ask for an update on the criminal fraud package we sent to the district attorney. Instead, I gave him a completely different directive. I told him I needed to establish an anonymous limited liability company in Delaware before the close of business today, completely insulated from my public identity and funded directly through my offshore trust. Malik paused for a long moment, the silence thick over the phone line. He asked me what exactly I was planning to buy. I told him I was going to buy my parents' debt. I was going to purchase the very chains they had wrapped around their own ankles. Driving back to my office at Sterling and Hughes, I let the strategy map itself out in my mind. In the world of high finance, commercial banks absolutely despise carrying non-performing loans on their books. A defaulted $200,000 business loan secured by a residential property is a massive bureaucratic headache for a bank. They have to hire foreclosure attorneys, deal with eviction notices, and eventually sell the property at auction, often taking a significant loss in the process. Bank managers will do almost anything to scrub that kind of toxic liability from their quarterly earnings report. I knew this because I cleaned up these exact types of corporate messes for a living, and I knew that if I approached the bank's asset recovery division with a clean, immediate cash offer to purchase the defaulted promissory note, they would hand the debt over to me without a second thought. By purchasing the note, my anonymous company would absorb all the rights of the original lender. The bank would step away completely, and I would become the sole legal lien holder of my parents' property. The absolute poetry of the situation was intoxicating. That four-bedroom brick house in the upscale suburbs was the crown jewel of Calvin and Yvonne's entire existence. Growing up, that house was treated with more reverence than I ever was. I remembered being 12 years old and strictly forbidden from sitting on the formal living room furniture because my mother wanted the velvet cushions to remain perfectly unblemished for her church group meetings. I remembered spending hours on my hands and knees pulling weeds from the front flower beds in the blazing summer heat, just so my father could stand on the porch and brag to his neighbors about the pristine condition of his estate. That house was the stage where they performed their perfect high society Christian family routine. It was where they hosted lavish Sunday dinners, parading Jada around like royalty, while I was relegated to the kitchen to wash the fine china. They loved those hardwood floors and crystal chandeliers more than they ever loved me. They had spent 3 decades leveraging that zip code to secure their status among the church elders. The fact that they had secretly mortgaged it to fund Logan's fake tech startup proved just how desperate they were to maintain their delusion of grandeur. And now I was going to buy the stage right out from under them. The next morning, I sat in the executive boardroom of the commercial bank's asset management division. I did not go as Kendra, the betrayed daughter. I went as the authorized representative of a private equity firm looking to acquire distressed real estate debt. I sat across from the senior portfolio manager, a rigid man who looked completely exhausted by his mounting pile of defaulted commercial loans. I placed a single immaculately prepared acquisition proposal on the table. I offered to purchase the $200,000 defaulted loan in full, paying in liquid cash via a direct wire transfer from my Delaware holding company. In exchange, the bank would assign the promissory note and the deed of trust directly to my firm. The portfolio manager looked at the offer, then looked up at me. He did not ask why a private equity firm was interested in one specific residential collateral file. In his eyes, I was just a corporate angel delivering him from a massive administrative headache right before the end of the fiscal quarter. He reviewed the proof of funds I had provided from my offshore trust, verifying that the cash was legitimate and ready to move. He practically tripped over himself trying to get the assignment contracts printed. While we waited for the legal department to draft the transfer documents, my mind drifted to what my family was likely doing at that exact moment. Calvin and Yvonne were undoubtedly living in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. The bank would have automatically mailed the official notice of default to their residents by now. They were probably running around Atlanta frantically trying to secure a predatory personal loan or begging their wealthy church friends for a bailout, desperately trying to keep their impending financial ruin a secret. They were likely screaming at Jada, demanding to know how Logan could have been so incredibly stupid. But what they did not know was that the bank they thought they were fighting was already bowing out of the ring, stepping aside to let an entirely different predator take control of the board. The portfolio manager returned with a thick stack of legal documents. I read through every single page with forensic precision. The assignment of the deed of trust was perfectly executed. The transfer of the promissory note was legally airtight. There were no loopholes, no contingencies, and no escape clauses. I pulled a sleek metal pen from my blazer pocket and signed my name on the authorized representative line. I signaled my wealth manager to initiate the wire transfer. Within 15 minutes, the confirmation receipt populated on my secure tablet. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moved instantly across the global banking network, settling the bank's ledger and legally purchasing the catastrophic mistake my family had made. The portfolio manager stood up and shook my hand, thanking me for a seamless transaction. He handed me a thick red folder containing the original notarized deed of trust and the defaulted promissory note. I walked out of the bank with my head held high, the heavy folder gripped firmly in my hand. I got into my luxury car and placed the red folder on the passenger seat. I stared at the embossed seal on the cover. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face as the absolute magnitude of what I had just accomplished settled into my bones. Because of their blinding arrogance, because they believed they were entitled to steal my hard-earned wealth, my parents had actively signed away their safety net. And now the legal transaction was complete. The state registry would update by the end of the business day. Calvin and Yvonne no longer owed the commercial bank a single dime. They owed me. My holding company was now the sole undisputed lien holder of their pristine suburban estate. I literally owned the roof over their heads, the floors they walked on, and the walls that sheltered their toxic pride. And I was going to use every single ounce of that legal authority to evict them from the delusion they had forced me to live in for 33 years. I turned the key in the ignition of my car and let the engine roar to life. The heavy red letter, containing the deed to my parents' house, sat on the passenger seat, radiating absolute power. I had just secured the ultimate leverage over the people who raised me, but I was not entirely finished. Taking their house was the punishment for my mother and father. Now it was time to collect the ammunition required to obliterate Logan. I punched the Midtown Atlanta address into my navigation system and pulled out of the bank parking lot. The drive to the luxury high-rise took less than 20 minutes. The building was a towering monument to modern excess, wrapped in reflective glass and surrounded by manicured landscaping. This was exactly the kind of place my sister Jada had always dreamed of living, in the kind of address she constantly pressured my parents to help her afford. Instead, her husband was using $250,000 of fraudulent commercial debt to rent a penthouse suite for a 23-year-old digital influencer. The absolute audacity of it fueled my every step. I did not bother stopping at the concierge desk. I timed my entrance perfectly, slipping through the secure glass doors right behind a resident carrying groceries. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the 32nd floor. When the polished metal doors slid open, I walked down the quiet carpeted hallway until I reached the unit number I had pulled from the property management database. I knocked firmly on the heavy wooden door. A few seconds later, the locks clicked and the door swung open. Chloe Davis stood in the doorway. She looked exactly like her social media profile, dressed in a matching set of designer silk loungewear, holding a small dog under one arm. She looked at my tailored navy suit and my completely unamused expression with a mixture of confusion and mild annoyance. "Can I help you?" Chloe asked, shifting her weight and looking me up and down. I did not introduce myself as Jada's sister. I stepped forward, forcing her to instinctively take a step back into the foyer, and I walked right into the apartment. The space was enormous, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows with a breathtaking view of the Atlanta skyline. White leather furniture, expensive modern art, and high-end electronics filled the room. Logan was spending $4,000 a month on this lease, while his actual wife was busy selling real estate 60 hours a week just to keep their suburban lights on. "My name is Kendra," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. "I am a corporate forensic accountant. I am here to inform you that the $4,000 automated clearinghouse transfer scheduled to pay your rent on the 1st of the month will be returned for insufficient funds. Furthermore, the man who has been paying for this apartment is currently the primary target of a federal wire fraud and identity theft investigation." Chloe dropped the small dog. It scampered away across the hardwood floor. The annoyance vanished from her face, instantly replaced by genuine shock. "What are you talking about? Logan is a tech CEO. He owns a software company. We are moving to Silicon Valley next year." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. I slowly closed the front door behind me, locking it. Logan does not own a software company. Logan does not even know how to code. He is an unemployed grifter who forged a legal document to steal $200,000 from my personal investment portfolio to fund this lifestyle. The commercial bank froze his accounts this morning. He is completely broke, and the federal authorities are currently reviewing his transaction history. Chloe backed away from me, her hands flying to her mouth. "You are lying," she stammered, her voice pitching upward in panic. "He showed me his bank accounts. He showed me his crypto wallet. He has millions. He told me he was divorced. He said his crazy ex-wife drained his retirement, but he was rebuilding his empire." "He is very much married," I corrected sharply. "He is married to my older sister. They live in a suburban house that is currently facing foreclosure because he gambled away the money he stole from me on a decentralized crypto exchange." I walked further into the living room and turned to face her. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The cold corporate reality of the situation was terrifying enough. "Listen to me very carefully, Chloe," I said, projecting absolute authority. "Receiving funds derived from a federal bank fraud scheme makes you a material accessory to the crime. When the authorities execute the search warrants, they are going to trace the stolen money directly to this lease. They are going to seize everything in this apartment purchased with those funds. Unless you can definitively prove that you were a victim of his deception and not a willing participant in the fraud, you are going to be indicted alongside him." The 23-year-old girl completely shattered. The glamorous influencer facade melted away, leaving behind a terrified kid who realized she had just ruined her life for a man who lied about his entire existence. Tears welled up in her eyes and spilled over her perfectly contoured cheeks. "I did not know," she sobbed, backing up until she hit the edge of the kitchen island. "I swear I did not know he was married. I did not know the money was stolen. He told me he was an investor. He bought me this apartment because he said he needed a private place to work when he was in the city. What do I do? Please, you have to believe me." I took my smartphone out of my pocket and unlocked it. "Then prove it to me right now," I demanded. "Hand over your phone. Open your text messages with him. I need to see every single conversation, every bank transfer receipt, and every login credential he shared with you. If you give me the evidence I need to bury him, I will make sure the fraud investigators know you were completely cooperative. If you refuse, I will walk out that door and let the bank attorneys tear you to pieces." Chloe did not even hesitate. She practically lunged across the kitchen to grab her iPhone off the marble counter. With shaking hands, she bypassed the lock screen, opened her messaging application, and shoved the device directly into my hands. She was so desperate to save herself from federal prison that she willingly handed over the holy grail of digital evidence. I stood in her kitchen and began scrolling through months of communication. The absolute disrespect radiating from the screen was staggering. Logan had sent Chloe dozens of messages mocking my family. He referred to my parents as gullible church folk who would believe anything he said as long as he wore a suit on Sundays. He sent messages bragging about how easy it was to manipulate his wife, calling Jada a desperate, insecure woman who was too afraid of being single to ever question his finances. But the real treasure was buried in their media attachments. In an effort to impress his young mistress, Logan had sent her countless screenshots of his financial maneuvers. I found the digital receipts for the luxury car rentals and the Caribbean vacations he promised to take her on. And then I hit the absolute jackpot. Logan had sent Chloe the recovery seed phrase and the login credentials to his offshore cryptocurrency wallet, trying to prove to her that he was a genius day trader holding massive digital assets. I was so arrogant, so blinded by his own narcissism, that he handed the keys to his financial crimes to a 23-year-old girl just to boost his ego. I pulled out my own phone and quickly airdropped the entire message thread, all the attachments and the crypto wallet credentials directly to my device. Within 3 minutes, I had a complete, undeniable record of his entire double life, his confession to gambling away stolen funds, and his blatant mockery of the family that was currently destroying their own lives to protect him. I handed the phone back to Chloe. She was weeping quietly, leaning against the marble counter, hugging her arms across her chest. "Pack your bags," I told her, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "The property management company is going to serve you with a pay or quit notice the second this rent check bounces. Take whatever you can fit into your car and leave the state. If you try to contact Logan to warn him about this conversation, I will personally hand this data to the FBI before sunset. I will not call him, she cried, wiping her face frantically. I am leaving, I promise. I turned my back on her and walked out of the penthouse apartment, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. I stepped back into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. I had the deed to my parents' house in my bag. I had the complete digital destruction of Logan's marriage on my phone. The trap was fully loaded, and I was just waiting for the right moment to spring it. As I walked out of the luxury high-rise and approached my car, my phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. I looked down at the caller identification. It was my mother, Yvonne. I let it ring 4 times before I finally answered, pressing the phone to my ear without saying a word. Kendra, Yvonne commanded, her voice vibrating with a frantic, desperate energy. You need to come to the house immediately. We are calling a family meeting. Your father has invited Pastor Williams and the church elders. You are going to sit down in this living room. You are going to apologize for your wicked behavior, and we are going to fix this financial mess together as a family before the bank ruins us all. Get here by 6 o'clock, or God help me, you will not have a family left. She hung up the phone before I could respond. I pulled the device away from my ear and stared at the dark screen. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. They were actually trying to stage a religious intervention to shame me into paying off the debt they stole from me. They had invited an audience to witness my surrender. It was the most spectacular, beautiful mistake they could have possibly made. I unlocked my car door and threw my bag onto the passenger seat. I was not just going to attend their intervention, I was going to turn it into an execution. I pulled my luxury sedan onto the quiet suburban street where I grew up and immediately saw the ambush waiting for me. My parents' driveway was packed shoulder to shoulder with vehicles I recognized instantly. There was my aunt's silver Cadillac, my uncle's heavy-duty pickup truck, and parked right in front of the walkway, the sleek black Lincoln belonging to the senior pastor of our family church. Calvin and Yvonne had not just called a family meeting. They had convened a full ecclesiastical kangaroo court. They were bringing the full suffocating weight of Southern black church respectability politics down on my shoulders. They intended to lock me in a room with the elders quote scripture until I felt sufficiently guilty and publicly shame me into handing over $250,000 to save their pristine reputation. I turned off my engine, grabbed my leather bag, and stepped out into the evening air. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety. I felt like a predator walking into a cage full of trapped prey. When I opened the heavy front door and stepped into the formal living room, the ambient chatter died instantly. The staging of the room was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. My mother sat on the velvet sofa, dabbing her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken matriarch. My father stood near the window looking solemn and heavily burdened. Jada sat curled up in a plush armchair, her knees pulled to her chest, trying to look as fragile and victimized as possible. And there, standing by the brick fireplace with his hands buried deep in his pockets, was Logan. He had dressed down in a simple sweater, his shoulders hunched perfectly, playing the part of the stressed, misunderstood entrepreneur who just needed a little grace. Surrounding them were 3 of my oldest aunts, 2 uncles, and sitting squarely in the center of the room in a high-backed accent chair was Pastor Miller. He held a leather-bound Bible in his lap. He looked at me with an expression of profound, manufactured disappointment. Kendra, Pastor Miller said, his voice dropping into that soft, melodic cadence designed to project spiritual authority. Please come in and sit down. We are gathered here tonight, not in anger, but in love. We are here to heal a fracture in this family before it breaks beyond repair. I did not sit down. I stood perfectly still near the archway, my posture completely rigid, letting my eyes sweep across the room. I wanted to look at every single face present so I could remember exactly who had shown up to participate in my financial execution. My father cleared his throat, taking a step toward the center of the room. He addressed the pastor and the elders, entirely avoiding my gaze. As you all know, Calvin began, his voice thick with fake humility. The devil has been testing our family this week. The bank has made a terrible administrative error regarding a commercial loan. They have frozen accounts and are threatening to take this very house, the home where Yvonne and I raised our girls and hosted so many church fellowships. We are facing an imminent foreclosure, all because of a misunderstanding. I stared at him, marveling at the effortless lie. He was actually telling the church elders that the impending foreclosure was a banking error. He completely omitted the fact that he and my mother had secretly pledged their house as collateral for a fraudulent loan originated with a forged signature. They were painting themselves as innocent victims of a ruthless financial system. Yvonne let out a loud, theatrical sob, burying her face in her hands. My aunt immediately leaned over and rubbed her back, shooting me a look of absolute disgust. "It is just money," Yvonne wailed to the room. "It is just paper. But Kendra is letting her pride destroy us. She has the resources to clear up this misunderstanding today. She has more than enough wealth sitting in her accounts. But she is refusing to help her own blood because she holds bitterness in her heart. She wants to see us out on the street." Pastor Miller opened his Bible, running his hand over the thin pages. "The scripture tells us to honor thy father and thy mother," Kendra, he preached gently. "It tells us that to whom much is given, much is required. You have been blessed with an incredible career and massive financial abundance. But wealth means nothing if you lose your soul in the process. Your parents provided for you. They gave you the foundation to become the woman you are. Now they are in their hour of deepest need, and you are turning your back on them out of spite." Then the absolute unthinkable happened. Logan spoke. He uncrossed his arms and took a step forward, looking at the pastor with an expression of deep, manufactured sincerity. "Pastor, I take full responsibility for my part in this," Logan said, his voice dripping with fake contrition. "I was just trying to build a software company to provide a better life for Jada. I got in over my head with some aggressive vendors and the commercial loan process got complicated. But I swear, if Kendra just helps us clear this banknote to save Calvin and Yvonne's house, I will pay her back every single penny with my first round of venture capital funding. We just need her to sign the release forms and advance the cash." Jada nodded vigorously from her armchair, wiping away actual tears now. "She is just trying to ruin my marriage," Jada cried out to the room. "Kendra has always been jealous that I found a good man who actually loves me. She is using a simple banking mistake to tear my husband down and put my parents on the street. She is toxic." The room erupted into low murmurs of agreement. My aunts shook their heads, whispering about how corporate greed had poisoned my mind. My uncles looked at me with open hostility. They had all bought the narrative hook, line, and sinker. They genuinely believed I was a rich, vindictive spinster, actively choosing to make my elderly parents homeless, just to punish my sister for being happily married. They expected the crushing weight of their collective disappointment to break me. They expected me to crumble under the spiritual guilt, drop to my knees, beg for forgiveness, and write a check for $250,000 just to restore my standing in the family. I stood there and absorbed every single insult. I let the hypocrisy wash over me, feeling nothing but a soaring electric anticipation. I looked at my mother, who was peeking at me through her fingers to see if her performance was working. I looked at Logan, who was standing tall by the fireplace, practically glowing with the belief that his white privilege and my parents' church clout were going to save him from federal prison. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself to the pastor. I did not explain the forgery or the bank fraud to my aunts. Arguing with them would only validate their authority over me, and they had absolutely no authority left. I calmly unzipped my leather designer bag and pulled out my iPad. I walked right past the pastor, right past my glaring aunts, and marched straight toward the massive 75-inch flat-screen television mounted directly above the brick fireplace where Logan was standing. I reached behind the television, pulled out the HDMI cable, and plugged it directly into the adapter on my device. The screen flashed black for a fraction of a second before mirroring my display. I turned around to face the entire room. The murmurs died instantly. Every eye was locked on me, entirely unsure of what I was doing. I looked directly at Pastor Miller, then shifted my gaze to my mother and my sister. I offered them a slow, terrifying corporate smile. "You want to talk about honor?" I said, my voice echoing off the hardwood floors with absolute crystalline authority. "You want to talk about family duty, venture capital, and banking mistakes? That sounds like a wonderful idea. Let us talk about exactly where that $200,000 went. The 75-inch screen blinked to life. Instead of a heartwarming family photo montage or a scripture verse, the stark black and white text of a certified legal deposition filled the display. I tapped my iPad screen, and a bright yellow digital highlighter dragged slowly across the exact paragraph I needed them to see. Then I pressed play on the embedded audio file. Jada's shrill, arrogant voice echoed through my parents' immaculate living room, playing through the expensive surround sound speakers my father had installed just for movie nights. Mom and I had to sign your name on that power of attorney because you were too cheap and too bitter to help your own family. The collective gasp from the church elders was audible. Pastor Miller lowered his leather-bound Bible to his lap, his mouth falling slightly open as he stared up at the screen. My aunt, who just moments ago had been rubbing my mother's back in a show of unified family solidarity, slowly pulled her hand away and shifted to the edge of the sofa. Yvonne jumped up from the velvet cushions, her hands trembling as she pointed at the television. She tried to shout over the audio, claiming the recording was doctored, screaming that I was using deceptive technological tricks to frame my own flesh and blood just to save my money. But you cannot gaslight a room full of people who are reading a certified court reporter's transcript while listening to the raw, unedited audio of a confession. I looked directly at Pastor Miller and asked him if felony forgery fell under his definition of honoring thy mother and father. I looked at my uncles, the men who had just been glaring at me with open hostility, and asked if stealing $250,000 from a black woman who worked 80-hour weeks was considered uplifting the family unit. Nobody answered me. The suffocating weight of their own hypocrisy had pinned them to their seats. They were staring at the undisputed proof of a massive criminal conspiracy, orchestrated by the very women they had just been praying over. But I was not finished. I turned my attention away from the silent church elders and locked eyes with my older sister. Jada was gripping the armrests of her plush chair so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Her husband Logan had completely abandoned his posture of the misunderstood, stressed entrepreneur. He was sweating profusely by the fireplace, his eyes darting frantically toward the hallway leading to the front door. "You forged my name to fund your husband's visionary tech startup," I said, keeping my voice loud enough to command every corner of the vast living room. "You risked federal prison because you were absolutely certain he was building a software empire that would secure your status as the wealthiest couple in this congregation." I swiped my finger across the iPad screen. The deposition transcript vanished. A commercial lease agreement populated the massive television. I used my digital highlighter again, dragging the yellow line over the monthly rental amount of $4,000 and then squarely over the tenant name, Chloe Davis. I looked at Jada and asked her if she knew that her visionary husband's tech startup was actually a 23-year-old digital influencer living in a luxury midtown high-rise. Jada stopped breathing. She stared at the screen, her brain struggling to process the legal document displaying her husband's banking routing number, paying for another woman's penthouse. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. Logan let out a panicked, strangled noise. He took a stumbling step toward the television, begging me to turn it off loudly, claiming the documents were fake, a setup, a misunderstanding generated by a jealous ex-employee. He pleaded with the pastor, swearing on his life that he had never met a woman named Chloe. I did not turn the screen off. I swiped my finger again. High-resolution photographs filled the display in a sickening, unavoidable slideshow. Logan and Chloe drinking expensive champagne on the deck of a private chartered boat in the Caribbean. Logan and Chloe posing intimately in front of a rented exotic sports car in the center of Buckhead. Logan kissing the side of her head on a luxury balcony overlooking the Atlanta skyline. The older women in the room gasped loudly. My mother brought both hands to her face, a sound of genuine, unfiltered horror escaping her throat. This was not just a financial crime anymore. This was a catastrophic moral failure broadcast directly into the center of her high society church circle. I swiped the screen one more time, bringing up the screenshots of Logan's text messages. I did not just let them read the text. I read the messages aloud, so the elders sitting in the back row could hear every single devastating word. I read the text where Logan called my parents gullible churchfolk who would believe absolutely anything he said as long as he wore a suit on Sundays. I read the messages where he mocked my father's desperate need for a white son-in-law to parade around the country club. I read the exact text where Logan called his own wife a desperate, insecure woman who was too terrified of being single to ever question where he went at night. I delivered the final financial blow, pulling up the blockchain ledgers, showing the remaining stolen loan money, and Jada's entire life savings being liquidated in high-risk crypto gambling. I announced to the hushed room that the brilliant savior my parents had mortgaged their souls to protect was nothing but a broke, unemployed grifter who was actively driving them all into bankruptcy to fund his double life. The facade of the golden child's perfect marriage did not just crack, it was obliterated in front of the very people whose approval my parents worshipped above all else. Logan realized the execution was complete. The federal fraud charges were pending, his offshore accounts were frozen, and his meal ticket had just discovered his absolute betrayal. The men in the room were staring at him with undisguised disgust. He spun around, completely abandoning his weeping wife and my horrified mother, and sprinted for the heavy oak front door. He grabbed the polished brass handle and yanked it, intending to bolt down the driveway, jump into his least luxury vehicle, and escape into the night. The handle did not budge. Logan yanked it again, his shoulder slamming against the heavy wood in sheer, unadulterated panic. He rattled the deadbolt, letting out a frustrated curse. I stood perfectly still by the brick fireplace and tapped a single button on my smartphone application. I informed Logan that I had taken the liberty of remotely locking the perimeter smart gates and the front door security system before I started my presentation. I told him he was not going anywhere until I was entirely finished. Jada finally snapped out of her state of catatonic shock. A decade of built-up entitlement, the sudden realization of her absolute financial ruin, and the profound, crushing public humiliation ignited inside her all at once. The sister who had spent her entire life looking down on me, who believed she was superior because she had managed to secure a husband, finally shattered. She let out a primal, deafening scream that actually rattled the crystal light fixtures above our heads. She lunged across the entryway. She grabbed the massive, heavy porcelain vase resting on the console table, the antique floral vase my mother prized above all other decorations in the house, and hurled it directly at Logan's head with terrifying force. The heavy porcelain smashed against the solid oak door just inches from his face, exploding into 100 deadly fragments and showering him in shattered ceramic and stagnant flower water. Logan fell backward onto the hardwood floor, scrambling away from his enraged wife as she lunged at him, tearing at his sweater and screaming obscenities that made the pastor physically recoil. My uncles had to leap out of their chairs to pull Jada off him, dragging her back into the living room while she thrashed and sobbed uncontrollably. The perfect high society Christian family illusion was officially dead, lying in a million jagged pieces on the floor, right alongside the shattered vase. The sound of shattering porcelain still echoed through the massive living room, mingling with the frantic, ragged breaths of my sister. My uncles struggled to drag a thrashing Jada away from the entryway, her designer heels slipping on the polished hardwood floor as she screamed obscenities that made the church elders physically recoil. Logan was scrambled backward against the expensive wainscoting, his hands bleeding slightly from a tiny shard of the vase. His eyes were wide with absolute, primal terror as he realized he was trapped behind the smart locks I had secured from my phone. The golden marriage was dead, lying in a million jagged pieces, right alongside my mother's prized antique floral vase. Pastor Miller stood up slowly from his high-backed accent chair. He closed his leather-bound Bible with a heavy, definitive thud that commanded the immediate attention of everyone not currently wrestling my sister. He looked at my mother, who was hyperventilating on the velvet sofa, and then shifted his gaze to the cowering white son-in-law they had practically worshipped. The disgust on the pastor's face was absolute and unwavering. He did not offer a closing prayer. I did not extend a hand of spiritual comfort. He simply shook his head, turned his back on my parents, and walked straight toward the back exit. My aunts, the same women who had sat there judging my single status and my corporate career just 20 minutes ago, were suddenly grabbing their coats in a frantic, uncoordinated rush. They were clutching their pearls, completely scandalized by the undeniable proof of infidelity, offshore crypto gambling, and federal forgery. The facade of the respectable high society Christian family had been violently ripped away, and nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius of the impending legal scandal. They fled the house through the side doors without offering a single goodbye, leaving their half-empty teacups and my parents' shattered dignity behind. The heavy doors clicked shut, leaving only the immediate family in the wreckage of the living room. My father, Calvin, looked around his pristine, silent house. He looked at the shattered porcelain, at his weeping golden child, and finally at the broke, cheating fraud of a man he had mortgaged his entire existence to impress. The reality of the impending commercial bank foreclosure suddenly crashed down on my father with crushing, inescapable gravity. His knees literally buckled. Calvin, the proud, booming patriarch who loved to stand at the church pulpit and lecture the congregation about black excellence and financial discipline, collapsed onto the hardwood floor right in front of me. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his aging, lined face. He reached out his shaking hands, hovering just inches from my tailored navy trousers. "Kendra, please," Calvin begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate sob. "He tricked us. Logan lied to us all. We were just trying to help him build a legacy for your sister. We did not know he was stealing your money to pay for another woman's apartment. You have to help us. You have the wealth. You are the only one who can pay the commercial bank before they execute the foreclosure." Yvonne finally found her voice, slipping down from the velvet sofa to kneel beside her husband. Her perfect church lady wig was slightly askew, her makeup ruined by tears of pure panic. "We are so sorry, Kendra," she wailed, grasping at the air between us. "We made a terrible mistake. But please, you cannot let them take our home. This is where we raised you. This is our family legacy." I looked down at the two people kneeling at my feet. I stared at the man and woman who had spent 33 years calling me a stubborn, bitter failure. These were the parents who had emotionally discarded me because I chose to study forensic accounting and build my own empire instead of marrying the first man who offered me a ring. They had tried to steal my financial future actively, forged my signature on federal banking documents, and happily signed away their own safety net just to protect the illusion of Jada's superiority. They had called an entire congregation together tonight specifically to shame me, to bully me, and to extort me. And now, after throwing me to the wolves, they expected me to become their financial savior. "You did not raise me in this house, Dad," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "You housed me here while you poured all of your love, your financial resources, and your respect into Jada. You were perfectly willing to let a commercial bank destroy my career and seize my personal assets to cover your criminal mistakes. You sat in a recorded deposition and proudly admitted to committing a federal felony against your own flesh and blood." I took a deliberate step forward, forcing my parents to lean back. "You do not care about the truth, Mom," I continued, my gaze shifting to Yvonne's terrified face. "You only care about the truth right now because the bill has finally come due. You bet your entire life on a man who despised you behind your back, and you lost." Calvin clasped his hands together in a posture of desperate prayer. "I will do whatever it takes, Kendra. I will work 3 jobs. I will pay you back every single cent. Just please call the commercial bank, pay off the defaulted loan, save our house." I did not break eye contact with my father. I slowly unzipped my leather designer bag. I reached inside and felt the smooth, crisp edges of the heavy red folder I had secured from the commercial bank's asset management division. I pulled the folder out into the light of the crystal chandelier. I stepped forward, my heels crunching over a stray piece of broken porcelain, and dropped the red folder squarely onto the center of the glass coffee table. The heavy thud of the documents hitting the glass echoed through the silent room. "I didn't just pay the bank, Dad," I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute, chilling authority. Calvin and Yvonne stared at the red folder, their tear-filled eyes widening in total confusion. Jada stopped her sobbing, looking up from the arms of my uncles. Logan pressed himself harder against the wall, realizing that the corporate execution was not quite finished. "I bought the defaulted debt directly from their commercial portfolio," I explained, watching the dawn of comprehension slowly drain the remaining life from my parents' faces. "The bank does not own this house anymore. I do. And right now, all of you are trespassing." The shattered pieces of my mother's prized porcelain vase crunched under my designer heels as I took a deliberate step toward the center of the living room. My father, Calvin, remained on his knees, his hands trembling as he stared at the red folder on the glass coffee table. My mother, Yvonne, was completely frozen on the velvet sofa, her breath catching in her throat in short, shallow gasps. Jada sat slumped against the wall, mascara running down her face in thick black rivers, staring blankly at the destruction she had just caused. Logan was trembling in the corner, clutching his bleeding hand, finally understanding that his grand illusion was dead and buried. I reached into my bag one last time. I pulled out 4 crisp, legally binding documents. I did not toss them. I walked over and placed one directly in front of each of them. These are official 30-day notices to vacate the premises, I stated, my voice echoing in the sudden, suffocating quiet of the house. As the sole legal lien holder and new property owner, I am exercising my right to terminate your residency. You have exactly 30 days to pack your belongings and leave my property. If anyone is still inside this house by midnight on the 30th day, I will have the county sheriff physically remove you for trespassing. There was no screaming. There were no more scripture quotes or desperate pleas for family loyalty. The fight had been completely drained out of them. They stared at the eviction notices with empty, hollow eyes. The crushing weight of absolute defeat settled over the room like a heavy shroud. They had played a high-stakes game with my financial future, expecting me to fold out of misplaced guilt. Instead, they had gambled away their entire kingdom and handed me the crown. I turned my back on the wreckage, unlocked the front gate, using my smartphone app, and walked out into the cool Atlanta night. The justice that followed was swift, brutal, and entirely public. Within 48 hours, the federal authorities moved on the evidence my attorney Malik had provided. Logan was sitting in the driveway of the suburban house trying to pack his leased luxury vehicle with whatever valuables he could salvage when 2 unmarked black vehicles pulled up to the curb. Federal agents arrested him in broad daylight for wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud. Neighbors who had attended my parents' lavish Sunday dinners stood on their perfectly manicured lawns, watching in hushed shock as the visionary tech entrepreneur was handcuffed and placed in the back of a federal vehicle. Jada lost everything. The commercial bank froze her remaining accounts, leaving her with absolutely no access to cash. The designer clothes, the luxury handbags, and the fake high society lifestyle vanished overnight. The golden child who had spent 35 years looking down on me from a pedestal my parents built was forced to pack her belongings into cheap garbage bags. She moved into a rundown weekly rate motel near the interstate, too humiliated to show her face in our usual social circles. She immediately filed for a messy, highly publicized divorce, but there were no assets left to divide. Logan had gambled her life savings away on cryptocurrency and spent the rest funding his 23-year-old mistress. Jada was left completely bankrupt, stripped of her pride, and forced to face the terrifying reality that her entire existence had been a hollow performance. Calvin and Yvonne suffered a fate worse than financial ruin. They lost their social standing. The news of the failed church intervention spread through the congregation like wildfire. The pastor and the church elders, utterly disgusted by the undeniable proof of fraud and deceit they had witnessed in that living room, quietly but firmly asked my parents to step down from all their leadership positions. The people my parents had spent decades trying to impress suddenly stopped returning their phone calls. The invitations to high-profile church galas and country club brunches completely disappeared. They were shunned by the very community they had sacrificed me to impress. Without the house, without their status, and with their savings depleted from trying to maintain their fake lifestyle, my parents had nowhere left to hide. I watched from a distance as reality crashed down on them. They were forced to rent a cramped, low-income apartment on the far outskirts of the city, miles away from the affluent neighborhoods they worshipped. They had to pack 30 years of accumulated luxury items, most of which they ended up selling just to cover their moving expenses. The grand commanding patriarch and the untouchable church matriarch were reduced to ordinary people living with the devastating consequences of their own toxic arrogance. They had tried to destroy me to save their reputation, and in doing so, they had authored their own complete destruction. Exactly 30 days later, I drove back to the suburban house. The autumn air was crisp and clear. I parked my luxury sedan in the driveway and stepped out, walking up the familiar brick pathway. The property was entirely silent. The massive oak front door was unlocked, left ajar by people who had nothing left to protect. I stepped inside the empty house. The velvet sofas, the crystal chandeliers, the heavy mahogany dining table where they had ambushed me with that forged banking document, everything was gone. The rooms echoed with emptiness, stripped of the oppressive, judgmental energy that had suffocated me for my entire childhood. I walked through the formal dining room, trailing my hand along the wall, feeling absolutely no nostalgia. I did not feel a single shred of guilt. I felt incredibly light, as if a massive, suffocating weight had finally been lifted from my chest. A commercial van pulled into the driveway, and a team of contractors stepped out, carrying heavy toolboxes. I greeted the foreman at the door and gave the authorization to change every single lock on the property, install a high-grade security system, and prepare the house for an immediate market sale. I stood on the porch watching the contractors remove the old brass hardware from the front door. The mechanism clicked, and the old keys were rendered completely useless. The physical boundary was set, mirroring the emotional boundary I had already built. I turned away from the house and walked back down the driveway. I opened the door to my car, slid into the plush leather driver's seat, and pressed the ignition button. The engine purred to life. I did not look back at the house in the rearview mirror. I drove away, heading back toward downtown Atlanta, back toward my upscale condo, my thriving forensic accounting firm, and the immense, beautiful wealth I had built entirely on my own. I had faced the darkest parts of my family, exposed their lies, and reclaimed my future. The wreckage of their entitlement was left far behind me, and ahead was nothing but pure, unadulterated peace. The greatest lesson, hidden in the wreckage of a toxic family dynamic, is that blood does not automatically grant someone a backstage pass to your life, your peace, or your hard-earned success. For years, we are conditioned to believe that we must endlessly forgive and finance the mistakes of our relatives simply because we share a last name. But true family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering support, and accountability, not manipulation, entitlement, or extortion. When you are cast as the scapegoat, it is easy to internalize the narrative that you are a disappointment. Yet the exact independence they criticize will eventually become the unbreakable foundation of your empire. Setting an absolute, immovable boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You do not owe your safety net to people who would gladly push you off a ledge just to cushion their own fall. Your greatest victory is never shouting the loudest. It is standing firmly in your truth, protecting your assets, and letting their own arrogance orchestrate their spectacular downfall. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own future? Drop your experience in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power.